I find today's text, because this is the feast of the baptism of Jesus. And I find it fascinating in Matthew that once you get past this long genealogy and the visit of the wise ones from the east, the rulers from the east, once you get past that, very early as Matthew's telling the story of Jesus, we come to a baptism. Not just any baptism, but a significant baptism, the baptism of Jesus. And then, as if it's a book, we got bookends. At the very end of Matthew, though some scholars are always in conversation about whether that last piece was added later or not, it doesn't matter. When you get to the end of Matthew, you have what I grew up as calling the Great Commission. The Great Commission, go into all the world and make disciples. Jesus kind of encouraging the disciples and followers to hear and do what? Baptize. Teach them the ways of Jesus. I was raised, as many of you here know, in a faith tradition in which baptism, but they called it always believers' baptism, was pretty important stuff. Baptists only saw how water should be used in the church one way, and that's immersion. Dunk them under until they come up spitting. That was kind of the line that my old pastors had. And as I posted on the church Facebook page, and I've said before, my dad thought it was a good idea because we were children that my sister and I be baptized together. And so Preacher Parham dropped me and I went all the way to the bottom. And my dad was sure that it would have stuck, but it kind of ran out of steam. And I ended up in the United Church of Christ, who takes in all strays, apparently. That said, this is an interesting baptism. This is a unique baptism. Fred Craddock reminded me that there are all kinds of behaviors that people adjust to and know about in church for special occasions. We know how to behave. But when we come to this text, we don't quite know what to do with it. We don't quite know how to behave exactly. You know, having been about this for a long time, pastor that is, I've been in places where I could watch people gather for memorial services and funerals where there was simply a graveside or whatever. And people will gather and they're pretty informal because many of them are neighbors. They knew the deceased. And they'll be standing around just talking about the ordinary stuff beforehand. What'd your mama say about that interesting haircut? Well, she wasn't very happy and just grunted and said it was my hair to mess up any way I wanted to. You get that done down at the Cutie Cuts where Dawn works? No, I tried a new place where Alfonso is now cutting. Okay. Well, did your husband go fishing yesterday? Yeah, but he brought home nothing to eat, never does. Every week he takes that boat out and burns up gas and takes a case of beer that I never get any of. And then as those conversations are taking place, suddenly the widow walks in and a hush falls on everyone, over everyone. This woman maybe has kids at home, and no one knows if her spouse left her any insurance or what their financial situation is. They've been neighbors, but they haven't been willing to pry. This is serious business, and it deserves our respect and our attention. At memorial services, this is how people behave. Weddings, of course, are more joyful, but they have some of the same characteristics. We know how we ought to treat weddings. People are standing around and they're waiting and they're waiting and they're waiting. And they're talking and talking and talking. You know how much Ola Mae spent on this wedding? I bet Harry had a fit. she spent at least as much this time as the time Sissy married that truck driver. And all of us knew that wasn't going to last more than 2 months. Don't tell me Ola Mae didn't see that coming. And suddenly, there's motion, and the preacher and the groom came in to the side, and bodies are all in motion, and then suddenly the organist hits a note, and the bride comes down the aisle, and everybody stands and smiles. They know to treat this a certain way. They sit there and they listen as the couple stands before the pastor, and they say, I give myself to you to be your wife or husband. I promise to love and sustain you in the covenant of marriage. And before you know it, there's a pronouncement made. People know how to act at weddings. They just do. But we come to the feast day of Jesus' baptism, and we read this brief passage from Matthew, and we scratch our heads and we wonder what it all means. We wonder what it means in terms of who Jesus was and what was going on. But we think about our baptisms, and we think about those we may have been to. We begin wondering, if you will, why Jesus would have simply not exempted himself from this sacred rite. Jesus certainly had no need to have himself ritually clean, have his so-called sins washed away. There were others, and they were present, and they needed to have their transgressions washed away in the Jordan. People like us. People have not always done honorable things, or wished or perhaps even done others harm. Cheated a little bit here and there on taxes or tests or temptations. Now, we're the kind of folk who ought to be in that oversized, dirty ditch called the Jordan River instead of Jesus. John says to Jesus, Jesus, you should baptize me. I should not baptize you. And somehow Jesus looks at him and says, leave it alone, John. It's appropriate to do God's will. Let's do it. Why? Why then? Jesus walks off his job. I know everybody says Jesus the carpenter. Truthfully, it's probably a stone cutter. Most likely he was a stone cutter. Hard work, not very good wages, same thing. At some point in life, he wanders off the job. And he works getting through some difficult places and works himself over to where John the prophet is baptizing people in the wilderness. Maybe it was something that had always been stirring in him for childhood, like the day he was lost when they went to Jerusalem with the crowds, and his mom and dad lost track of him and found him teaching in synagogue. Maybe it was a word from some old rabbi reading the Talmud that struck him just right, and he began to ponder what his mission in life truly was. Maybe it was the day the Roman guards showed up in Nazareth. They were always showing up, and they rounded up a few of the same suspects as always, and they arbitrarily strung them up as a lesson to those people in the village not to mess with the empire. There were serious consequences. Maybe it was that deep sense of injustice that he responded to. We don't know why, but it happened. Who fully understands the transaction between John and Jesus? John was viewed to be pretty important. There were those who would have put their money on John to be the Messiah if they'd had a chance. And yet in that moment, John defers to Jesus. Matthew wants us to know two things. He wants us to know it happened, and it's important that it happened. And he wants us to know that when it happened, the Spirit descended in the form of a dove. Now, unlike the other gospel, there's some tweaks between the gospel storytellers. Not the dove, but it says, as a dove comes and lights upon Jesus. And there's that voice. This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. And if you read the whole gospel, won't take that long, I promise you. If you read the whole gospel, you'll get that this took place, that this all took place long before Jesus began his journey of teaching people for years, wrestling with the powers that be, eventually even being crucified. In other words, this took place before Jesus had ever done anything. He received God's blessing. And get this, Jesus didn't come up out of the water saying, I'm somebody now. I'm a King of Kings. You'll treat me accordingly. Don't touch me. I'm pretty holy stuff. No, Jesus understood himself to be Isaiah's suffering servant, the one who gives his life touching and loving and giving and doing and caring for people. And so Jesus got up out of that river, clothes still dripping wet, and he went about God's business of tending the brokenhearted, the hungry, the diseased who had been ostracized because after all, if you were sick, you must have sinned, according to the theology that some held. Those who had been alienated from the community for different reasons. Every suffering person he met was Jesus' business. And he actually washed Jesus' feet. Jesus understood what his business was about. So I read a piece of this story for the board in December, and I'll share just a piece of it now. Fred Craddock writes about the time he was at his first pastorate in Oklahoma, long before he was known to be a great teaching preacher and a great preacher himself. And he said there was a group of men, a cadre, who met down at the cafe during Sunday worship. This was kind of the cafe church, if you will. They talked about stock prices and farm prices and politics and whatever else there was to talk about. There was one named Frank who was viewed to be kind of the leader of this church cafe. So Craddock says, one day I met Frank on the street and he knew I was a preacher. It's never been my custom to accost people in the name of Jesus. So I just shook hands and visited with Frank. And then he took to the offensive. He said, I work hard. I take care of my family. I mind my own business. He said that as far as he was concerned, everything else was fluff. He was telling me, leave me alone. I'm not a prospect. Boy, I've had that message driven home at places before. So I did not bother Frank. That's why I was surprised. Indeed, the church was surprised and the whole town was surprised. And all the men of the cafe church were absolutely bumfuzzled when old Frank, 77 years old, presented himself to me one Sunday morning for baptism. I baptized Frank. Some in the community said that Frank must be sick, said he must be scared to meet his Maker. Some said he's got heart trouble going up to be baptized. I never thought old Frank would do that. But I guess when you get scared, there were all kinds of stories. But this is the way Frank told it to me. We were talking the day after his baptism, and I said, Frank, do you remember that little saying you used to give me so much? I work hard. I take care of my family. I mind my own business. He said, yeah, I remember that. I said it a lot. you still say that, I ask? Yes, he said. Then what's the difference? And Frank said, I didn't know then what my business was. Frank discovered what his business was. It was to serve human need. And so I baptized Frank. It was said that old Martin Luther, whose intestines were always in an uproar, whose emotional state was so volatile, it was said that he would roam around and he could be heard not only fighting the devil, but quoting over and over again, remember your baptism, remember your baptism, remember your baptism. On those days, when the light is dim and my energy turns negative, and I feel worse about myself than a piece of roadkill laying on the side of 528 with the vultures munching on it. And I do have those days. I lift my eyes to the heavens, looking for any dove-like signs. I never see those dove-like signs, but I continue to look, and I mutter over and over again, remember your baptism. And I do remember my bizarre baptism, which was the beginning of my journey. Some of you here can't because you were baptized as infants. Perhaps you remember the days of confirmation when some pastor laid his empty hands on your empty head and blessed you. It's important to remember that in the sacrament, both sacraments, there's a gift of God, a naming, if you will. This is my beloved child. Because you too are God's beloved child. Long before I did anything in my life that was ever worthwhile, God pronounced me loved and sacred, made in God's image, of value beyond my ability to ever see. And the same is true of you. Well, no, you too. Each and every one of you. When you remember your baptism, take it to heart. Give thanks to God. And give thanks to God in remembering with great joy that somewhere along the line you learned what God's business is all about.